Good morning. Good morning. This is Valerie Leonard with Nonprofit Utopia. I want to welcome you here today. And if you can just hold on a moment, I'm going to pull up our presentation before I go one moment, before I go any further. I want to welcome you to Nonprofit Board Development Basics. We're going to focus this whole month on board development. And this is the first of a series. So today we're going to be going over basics of board development. I'm going to talk about the rules of the road, so to speak, as it relates to boards. And then next week, we're going to be talking about the different types of boards. So this will include things like governing boards, advisory boards, task force, and all those kinds of things. And then we will end up the final week, the last Friday in March, I believe that's the 27th, we will be focusing on how you can manage your board. So we'll touch on that a little bit today, but we'll do a deeper dive on the 27th. We will actually share some tools with you that you can use to manage your board and help it move more effectively. So before we get into today's lesson, I always like to tell people about Nonprofit Utopia. We are the ideal community for emerging nonprofit leaders. And our goal is to really prepare the next generation of leaders. We realize that baby boomers have about 10 good years left in the workforce officially. And it's my goal to make sure that we can transfer as much knowledge to the next generation as possible. And we do this in a number of ways. We do it through consulting, we do it through an online community, we also do it through coaching and other capacity building activities. And we want to create a safe environment where our members can speak candidly about issues that concern them, and we also share documents and share feedback on grant proposals and all that good stuff. And we have a number of activities. So when we look at this globally, we want to actually touch the whole world, so to speak. This will eventually become an international community. And by 2033, we hope to have touched 50,000 people around the world. That's our vision. So a little bit about me. I work with clients to help them address their most pressing problems. So that could be issues around proposal writing. It could be issues around collaboration. It could be issues around just holistic capacity building, where we're looking at the entire organization and looking at the strengths and weaknesses, and then figuring out ways to put systems in place so that the organization can run more efficiently. So I specialize in community and organizational development, and I'm also the host of the Nonprofit Utopia community. I am the host of the Nonprofit Utopia podcast, which comes on Mondays on Blog Talk Radio at 2 o'clock. And I also teach courses in, nonprofit management at UIC. And I teach courses in social enterprise at Roosevelt. And when I say UIC, I'm talking about the University of Illinois at Chicago. And I have a Master of Management degree from Kellogg and an undergrad degree in economics from Spelman College. So my question to you is, are you starting a new organization, and are you looking to better understand how to recruit board members who will help you grow the organization? Or are you considering joining a board and you want to get a general understanding as to what boards do before you take that plunge? Either way it goes, you are definitely in the right place. So we got a lot to cover today. We're going to talk about building your team. We're going to give you tips for keeping good board members. We're going to talk about the roles and responsibilities of board members. And if you are a member of Nonprofit Utopia, we have a whole set of documents that you can review that will help you run your organization more efficiently. That includes things like position description for every board position and all that good stuff. We will also talk about the stages in a nonprofit board's life cycle. We'll talk about the types of boards, and remember, we'll be taking a deeper dive into the different types next week. We'll also talk about transitioning from a working board to a governing board, and then common problems associated with boards, and then share some ways that you can address those problems. So the first thing you want to do is build your team. And I want to say this for folks who are actually in the process of developing their organizations. You want to do this before you start your organization in an ideal sense. You want to know who should be on your board. So you want to look at things like organizational fit. You want to make sure that their core values are consistent with the organization's core values. And you want them to be able to buy into the mission, the goals, and the objectives of the organization. As I said before, ideally, this would take place before you even incorporate. Realistically, that doesn't always happen. People tend to go ahead and get as many people on the board just so they can get the ball rolling, and then over time they replace those board members. The next thing you want to do is make sure that there's a commitment on behalf of those prospective board members. You want to make sure that you outline what's expected of them. And as I said before, for our members, we do have documents that you can use. We even have a sample contract that you can use for your board members, and you can tailor that any way you want to outline your expectations. You want to make sure that you have people who can attend board meetings and do the homework between the meetings. And that homework part is very important. And not only should they have the ability to do the homework, they should have the willingness to do it. And they should be willing and able to make a financial contribution, whatever that is. And you can determine what that is. And then they should have a demonstrated ability and willingness to leverage their own contacts and resources so that it benefits the organization. It shouldn't be just one person doing all of the work. So examples of people who might make good board members include people who are recently retired, people who are familiar with your services, and your clients are really familiar with your services. So they might be good people. In fact, I would recommend that you always have a client or end user of your services on your board to make sure that you keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening and make sure that your services are relevant. You also want to make sure that you have engaged community residents. All too often we have organizations that are not really well grounded in the community. They may be located in the community, but not really well grounded in the community. And you don't want that to be the case with your organization. Other good people might be local media people. They come in handy when you're trying to get the word out about what it is that you're doing. And then academics, they are really good to help you frame your research and put you in touch with others who can help you with the research and evaluation. And then executives on loan, or those who come recommended by civic or professional organizations. And you also want to make sure that there is diversity on your board. First of all, you need diversity of thinking. You don't want all the people on your board to think alike. You want to make sure also that they have complementary skill sets. And really good skill sets in an ideal sense would be someone with a legal background, someone with a financial background, someone who understands program development. But I caution you that when you bring on people who really are good at program development, sometimes there's a conflict of interest because the programs that they might be really good at might be the same type of program you're running, and there may be the potential for competing for the same resources. You also want to make sure you have people who understand marketing. And then from a racial perspective, you might want to get people who have various ethnicities, come from, they could be Black, white, or Latino, or Asian. You also want to look at backgrounds that vary with respect to profession. And again, you want people with differing perspectives, because one of the most dangerous things you can have on your board is insular thinking, where everybody thinks alike. That tends over time. It seems to work well when you're first starting. You can move pretty quickly. But as you start to grow, you'll find that insular thinking or that group think will hold you back. Okay, hi Sai, how are you? Welcome. Okay, we got a note, and for those of you who are on Facebook Live, I can't see your comments, but please feel free to comment, and I'll check your comments when I get off this call. And the same for you in YouTube Live. Please comment. We want you to like the video. We also want you to subscribe to the channel, and let us know what your thoughts are. Okay, and then for the folks on Facebook Live, if you go to my page, this is running, you'll see a link to join us. If you want to join us in Crowdcast so that I can see your comments live, you can click onto that link. And for those of you who can't see the link, we're at crowdcast.io/lowercase e/ and then this is all lowercase, board-development-basics. All right, so we've got a comment from Cy Lewis. Cy is a member of Nonprofit Utopia. She's one of our newest members, and we want to welcome her aboard. And she is in Chicago, Illinois, Macro 1, and she's still developing her board, and she has not had success with people staying true to their commitment as a board member. All right, that's a very, very common problem. And hopefully by the end of this month, Sai, we can help you work through some issues. We'll touch on some of that in today's conversation, and then we will also be going over stuff like that in the forum. So be sure to post your questions and concerns. We actually have a conversation that we started, I believe, last year, and then you can also post a fresh conversation, and we will be sure and engage you and share with you some of the tools, tactics, and strategies that we have used over time to get board members engaged and keep them engaged. But we do realize that is one of the most common and greatest challenges. Alrighty, so here you'll see, if you're in the chat room, you have a link to our handouts, and this is one of our handouts. This is a tool that I find to be very, very helpful. I use it as well as I share it with my clients. And this helps to recruit board members. It helps to really get a good sense for what the current makeup of the board is and see it all in one snapshot. So this first column is a list of who our current board members would be. And then this second set of columns gives their age range, and you just put a little checkbox there or an X. And then there's another area for the gender. And then we talk about the locale, which is, the community or the city or the suburbs. And then we have an area for the skill sets, and then the constituency. So you do that analysis for your current board, and then you do that for potential candidates. So you list that for your candidates. So you do it for your current board members first because you want to identify gaps, right? You want to identify areas where you might have too much of something. You might want to um, have, if you have predominantly older people on your board and you want to attract young people, you might want to use this to identify and actually demonstrate in a board meeting that you might have too many people in a certain age range. And when I say too many people is a certain age range, that's not to say that a board that is all seniors is wrong. That's not to say that a board of all young people is wrong. It's not to say that a board of all middle-aged people is wrong. But if your goal is to diversify your board with respect to age, then in an ideal sense, you want to get people from all of these particular groupings. All right, and the same with the skill sets. So after you analyze what you have, you identify what you need, right, or what you desire. So the second part of the spreadsheet where you have candidates, you look at what their skills are, and these are prospective candidates, people you are targeting. You look at what their skill sets and what they bring to the table and how they may help you to round out what you need. Okay? All right, so you will have a copy of this in the handouts. And again, if you are a member, we have other documents that we can share with you in the forum. And some of the things that you want to avoid, and it's really, really hard in the beginning, but this is something you really should not do. Select board members based on friendship. Because, in many instances, we have friends, they love us dearly, but they could care less about the stuff that we're passionate about, right? And I would guess, Sai, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, please feel free to comment in the chat room. And if you want to come out onto the screen, I can also bring you out into the screen so that you can share your comments and let us see your face. So that's one of the problems that we have with engagement, because we tend to bring people on that love us and don't love our mission. And then, getting them involved is not something that they like to do. Another problem is selecting family members unless the organization is intended to be a family foundation. And the reason why you don't want to do this, one, our families have one set of dynamics. We don't want to bring those family dynamics into the business of our organizations. Two, when the IRS looks at the applications, for granting tax exemption, they're going to be looking at the relationships. You have to disclose whether or not you have any familial relationships on your board. And if you have too many of those familial relationships and it looks like they're dominated by a family, flag, and there is a very good chance that you won't get approval the first go round because they don't want to have boards that have conflicts of interest, right? Another mistake that people make is bringing prominent people onto the board with the understanding that, we could just use their names, right? Okay, I see a comment from Sai. She says, the first mistake I made was selecting friends or people I thought would be good at it because they said they would have, instead of checking their background, resume, etc. That's a very, very common mistake, and don't beat yourself up about it. Often people say one thing and they do another, even if they have the the resume to back it up. Uh, Commitment is a thing of the heart. That's something that you can't. You have to really ask questions when it comes to commitment to get a sense for how they have demonstrated their commitment in past endeavors, and then your past relationship too. Don't believe what people say, believe what they do. Another thing, okay, we're talking about allowing prominent people to come on your board with the understanding that you can use their name. That doesn't do them any good, and it doesn't do you any good. One, they often become those people who are not engaged, and that could be very disheartening for people who come to the board meetings who are doing all the work and they're bringing the money. And then they see that these prominent people get a pass on all the homework. And sometimes they even get a pass on the donations, and they're doing all the work. So you don't want to create a situation where there's tension on your board because of, certain people who are prominent, they get a pass on the work. You don't want to approach your dream candidates while your organization is still in the development stages, because they may not have the same kind of relationship with you as a close friend or someone you've been working together. They may not understand or pardon your dust, so to speak, while you're under construction. They want to make sure that there's something really going on before they join. So work out the kinks before you bring on those dream candidates. But at the same time, don't just put people's names on the paper just so you can fulfill a requirement, right? You want to find out early on, as early as possible, whether or not people are in fact committed. And then another problem we have is inviting people to come onto the board solely because this is someone who has a big name in the community. Their name is going to be recognized. Just because people have big names doesn't mean that translates into commitment, doesn't mean it translates into work. All right, so now we're going to go into some tips for keeping good board members. The first thing you want to do, when you invite them in, you want to have an orientation. So you want to give them an overview of the mission. You want to let them know what the budget is. You want to share your strategic plan. You want to share the articles of incorporation. You want to share a funding application, an annual report, and that could be your Form 990s and any other annual report you might do. And then you want to have job descriptions for the board members, the officers, and the committee. So it's not just enough to talk about the duties of the board as a whole. You want to talk about individual responsibilities. And for those members, I do have sample applications that you can use that will get at some of these things. All right, you also want to make sure you keep contact information for the board and the staff. You want to give them, and you want to share that with all the board members so that there's communication between meetings ongoingly. And then you want to have an organization chart so they can understand how the workflows, how decisions are made. And you want to share your IRS letter. You want to share board policies and procedures, the board minutes. And if I didn't say bylaws, the bylaws. You want to also consider asking prospective recruits to serve in an advisory capacity before extending a full offer of membership. Why? For some of the reasons we just talked about. People can say they're committed. And if you guys can hold on for just a minute, my battery is running low and I don't want to get cut off. All right, just one moment. I got to plug in. All right, I'll be with you in just a moment. just okay, I'm sorry about that. All right, so you want to give people a chance to really demonstrate their commitment. So, Sai, I hope this is something, a tactic that you might consider using. Have a governing board, and those are the people who actually are responsible legally for everything that goes on. But then the advisory board, you're taking their advice and you want to see how they work out, right? So if you see promising members of that advisory board, those should be some of the first places you look when there becomes an opening on your board. And then you want to also, as I said before, require that new board members, they participate in an orientation and even onboarding, where you kind of partner them up with other board members, create a buddy system so that they feel comfortable and don't feel lost. And if you're the executive director, it helps if you would keep in contact with them, give them extra attention to make sure that they're moving along, smoothly, making a good transition into the organization. You also want to plan activities for ongoing development. And when I say ongoing development, I'm talking about making sure that they build their skill sets. That could be things like, going to conferences and workshops that might be helpful in helping them to do the work of a board member. There might be program development workshops, grant writing workshops, board development workshops, workshops on 990s to help them understand what to look for, anything that you think would help strengthen their ability to do their job as board members. Not that you want them to do programming, so to speak, but they need to get a good understanding of what's expected of them. And also, sometimes they may feel inadequate. It doesn't have to be the case, but they may feel inadequate to perform certain duties. And going to these workshops, doing this ongoing board development and team building helps them to bond. It helps them to be stronger members. You might also want to organize a board development committee. And this committee is one, they're meant to train the new board members, onboard them, monitor their attendance, and actually they're monitoring everybody's attendance. You don't want to just keep attendance for new members. You want to have them work with the secretary to monitor attendance and evaluate their participation and help them to fit within their roles. You also want to give board members specific projects tied to goals and achievements that you're looking for, for your organization. And then you want to keep board meetings productive and interesting, and you can do this by having food, things like having food, having guest speakers to talk about topics not just on board development, but, topics of the day to keep them current, keep the whole board current. You want to strictly enforce attendance rules and make sure that those attendance rules are in your bylaws, right? And the reason why I say that is because you can get to a point where attendance becomes so low that you can't transact business because you don't have a quorum, right? And that could be very, very dangerous. You want to follow up with board members who have missed meetings, and you want to thank board members for their involvement. Do it the Chicago way, early and often. And bylaws, we can't ever overlook or underestimate the importance of bylaws, because bylaws are exactly what they say. They're by law. They're legally binding, and they are done in alignment with the state code. So when you do your application for the IRS, they're going to be looking at your bylaws, and they want to make sure that there is an alignment with the state code. So these bylaws include provisions that govern the internal policies and procedures of the organization. So they don't get into the nitty-gritty detail of policies and procedures, but they're the backbone, and they govern everything else. And legally, every state has a minimum standard of the contents of the bylaws. So for those members of Nonprofit Utopia, if you need to see a copy of bylaws that in fact pass muster with the state of Illinois, I can share those with you. So just let me know in the Nonprofit Utopia forum if that's something that you need, and I can make sure I get it to you. So typically, by law, the executive committee has all the power and authority of the entire board, right? However, there are a couple of exceptions. First of all, the executive committee can't take it upon themselves as a group to select board members. That's a job for the whole board. They can't adopt, they can't amend, or repeal any of the bylaws. Again, that's a function for the whole board. And they can't have powers that are inconsistent with the resolutions passed by the board. So they can't have superpowers, or they can't do things that the bylaws don't allow for. So a couple tips. First of all, you want to make sure the bylaws are in compliance with current state law, yet they're flexible enough to serve the organization's desires to operate in an efficient manner. And you want to pay special attention to the more important bylaw provisions, such as quorum requirements, succession of officers, powers of the executive committee, voting rules. And if you're an executive director, you need to understand how you fall in that whole mix. Some executive directors are part of the board, some are not part of the board, some, if they are part of the board, they're voting members, and some are ex officio, meaning they're just there because they're an executive director, and once they leave, they no longer are part of the board and they don't vote. So you need to understand all of that stuff and where you fit in. So here is a sample board structure, right? And this is a board structure for a working board. And when I say working board, I'm talking about, okay, bear with me. When I say working board, I'm talking about a board for an organization that is just starting out, right? They don't have staff, and the board is expected to do much of what a staff would do. And please bear with me. I was sharing a clip. I'm sharing that with others, hoping they might join us. And if you're on, you can feel free to share a clip. There's a clip moment button on the lower left. If you think that there are other people who should be joining us, feel free to clip on to that link and share those special moments. And you can do that at any time during this presentation. So again, this is a working board. There's no staff. The board is doing all of the work. And in fact, I mentioned that this is usually for new boards. And yes, true, but there's some organizations that have been around for years, 20 and 30 years, and they still don't have staff. This is true of, say, block clubs, and then other organizations. They're all volunteer and no staff. All right, so the way this is structured is they have a board of directors, And then they have an advisory board that reports to the board of directors. There's an executive committee that is comprised of the president, the vice president, the secretary, the treasurer, and the treasurer heads the finance committee. And then the executive committee, which includes all of the officers, the program committee, the membership committee, the board development committee, the fundraising committee, and any other committee that you might have. It could be a standing committee like these, meaning that they're part of the regular organization. Including they're included in the bylaws. Or it could be an ad hoc committee. It could be, and when I say ad hoc committee, that's a committee that has come about just for a specific project. Okay, so there's a question, Valerie, how many people would this be? So we'll get into that, but the size of the board can vary. There's some boards for international organizations that have 100 people, and you really don't want that. That's too much to manage. I say a good size would be about 7 people for a new organization. And then for organizations that have been around, I would say about 15. That seems to be manageable, even though 15 can sometimes seem too small once you start with your committee structures. But I think 15 is manageable. And if you have a good advisory board and you got a good number of people in the committees that are headed by the board members, then you should be okay. There are some organizations that function very well with just 3 board members. So by law, you only need 3 board members. And when I say by law, I'm talking about Illinois state law. You only need 3 board members because those people would also be officers, your president, secretary, and treasurer. And that would be enough to that's enough to be legal, but it's not really enough to be really functional. Okay, did I answer your question, Sai? And if not, I think there's another slide where we talk about that. Okay, so here is, okay, you're quite welcome. Okay, so here is another example organization structure, and this is a board, and they also have a staff. So again, you've got the board of directors that's heading the organization, and then you've got the advisory board that reports to the board, but you also have the executive director that reports directly to the board, and then you have these different functions all reporting to the executive director. They do not, I repeat, they do not report directly to the board of directors. The only person on staff that reports to the board is the executive director. So these are typical functions. They could be departments or they could be people, depending on where your organization is, but is in terms of its growth, right? So every organization, whether you are 2 years old, whether you are just starting, incorporating, whether you're 100 years old, every organization is going to have a finance function. There's going to be a human resources function if they have people, whether they call it that or not, or whether it falls up under another job title or not. They all do human resources. They all do marketing. They may or may not do membership. It depends on whether or not it's a membership organization. They all do some sort of programs and services. And if they want to stay around, they all do some sort of fundraising. So again, these are functions and not necessarily departments, although they could be departments depending on how large the organization is. So legally, the first duty that board members have is that duty of care, right? So they are legally required to act with reasonable care while making decisions, right? So that means no rubber stamping. Every matter that comes before the board needs to be weighed carefully. You have to look at the pros, you have to look at the cons, and you have to be able to have good discussions about it. When you have one person bringing ideas and is rubber stamped, that's a recipe for disaster. So while making decisions, board members should be informed about alternatives and how they could possibly impact the outcomes that you're looking for. And then you want to minimize the risk. So again, you want to not just look at, oh, this is a wonderful idea. You have to look at how that's going to impact the organization's ability to carry out its mission, vision, goals, and meet objectives. So the second duty is the duty of loyalty. So that means that board members, their first loyalty, I don't care how many other organizations they serve, when they're with you and your organization, their first loyalty is to your organization. So they have to put the interests of the organization ahead of their own. There can't be any self-dealing. And usually when we talk about self-dealing, that's for foundations where people on the board of foundations get grants from the foundation. But you have similar issues, right, when you have organizations that don't necessarily give out grants, but they're giving out contracts, they're giving out jobs and all that other stuff. It's a conflict of interest when you are contracting with board members, when you are paying salaries to board members. That's really a conflict of interest, whether it's something that can be managed. It's something I would not recommend. Sometimes you just can't get around it, right? But in an ideal sense, you don't want to be in a position where you have every board member also getting something financial out of the deal, right? All of your board members getting paid somehow, all of your board members getting contracts, or getting some sort of fee, right? That's not why your organization exists. If the IRS were to look at that situation and they see too many conflicts of interest, then they will, recommend that. Well, actually, they're not going to recommend. They will just revoke your tax exempt status, if you don't correct it. So an example of self-dealing, not necessarily in the purest sense of the word, but in the sense of an organization that doesn't give out grants, would be a board member who votes to rent an office space, a space that he or she owns. Regardless of whether that person gives the space at a discount, it's still a conflict of interest, right? Because the board has to exercise responsibility and oversight over that contract. And if you're party to that contract and exercise and oversight, that's a conflict. So for that reason, when you have conflicts of interest, you have to disclose them. And you also have to recuse yourself if you're a voting member of the board and you have a financial interest or personal interest in the outcome of the decision. So also, the duty of loyalty says there should be no conflicts of interest. Again, you don't want to be in a situation where your loyalty is divided between yourself and the organization, divided between yourself and another organization. So that's why I mentioned before, when you are looking for board members who have skills in program management, or if they're sitting on another board, make sure that they can keep your business separate your business from the business of that other board. And when I say that, that means that whatever their standing is on that other board should not impact their decision on what's going on with your board. For example, there may be people who sit on two boards, one of which is yours, but these two boards may be going after the same funding source. That could be a potential conflict of interest well, it is a conflict of interest, but it could also be problematic in that sometimes people sit on board X so that they could take information away and support board Y, and it's not helping board X. So beware of those types of situations. That's why you do a membership application to find out what other boards people are sitting on. That's why you do a conflict of interest form where people disclose their potential conflicts of interest, so you know what you're dealing with and you could decide whether or not to accept the person on the board. And if you do accept the person, you'll put systems in place to make sure that you minimize the effects of those conflicts of interest. Roles versus responsibilities, or board roles versus staff roles. So often, if you don't have a staff, this is not a problem for you. You just have a board. Anything that needs to get done, the board has to do. But if you have a board and staff, there are differences in the roles from a legal perspective. The board governs the organization, sets strategic direction and policy, and the staff carries out those directives by the board. So they manage the day-to-day operations. So that's managing the budget, managing people, and shepherding fundraising proposals and all that other stuff. Typical board activities include setting strategic direction, outlining programs, and evaluating outcomes. So they're not necessarily designing the programs, but they're expressing the desire of what they want those programs to achieve. They are approving budgets and monitoring the financial condition. They're establishing and managing committees. They're hiring and managing the executive director. They're only hiring and only managing the executive director. Their hands need to be off every other employee. The other employees are the responsibility of the executive director. The board members also serve as ambassadors of the nonprofit to the public, and they also lead and help fundraising efforts. All right, so for those of you who are watching on Facebook Live, we are looking at nonprofit board development basics. Feel free to join us here in Crowdcast. You can click onto the link on my Facebook page, or you can go into crowdcast.io/e/board-development-basics. All right, so welcome aboard, and we will continue. Board officers, I think everybody is pretty familiar with this. We've got president, vice president, secretary, and the treasurer. We also know that the president presides over the meetings, he sets the agenda, but the board president should not be setting the agenda in the vacuum. The president should be setting the agenda with input from other board members and staff. The president appoints committees. Those committees are approved by the board. The president manages the executive director, and depending on what your bylaws say, it could be the board president or board chair who manages the executive director, or it could be the entire board that manages the executive director. Okay, question from Sai. Hiring and managing the ED is understood, but as the founder of the nonprofit, how do I protect my organization in choosing the board? So do you want to clarify what you mean, Sai? First of all, let me know if you want to come up on screen and ask the question after we're done, or if you want to just chat and clarify. My question to you is, when you say you want to protect your organization in choosing the board, are you saying that you as the founder want to, right, I had a feeling that's where you were going. That can very well happen. It's happened to me before, not by a board, but by a steering committee, and it was not fun to see all of the work that I did. I put in over 1,900 hours. I recruited folks to do a community planning process. I needed to leave that process for personal reasons. When funding that I helped apply for came through, and then they were in a position to hire, I applied for the job, and they didn't even think enough of me to interview. So that is effectively saying you're no longer needed. And that was a painful experience. And it happens time and time again where you, the founder, put so much effort into what you do. You bring on people. In fact, it happened to Steve Jobs with Apple. He founded Apple and he ended up being fired by his board. Legally, there's nothing you can do. That's more or less a political issue, because legally, once you create a nonprofit organization, it is really a corporation. It is a corporation that is owned by the community, so to speak, by the public trust, and it's managed and is governed by the board and managed by the staff. And once you create a legal entity, you're not the owner, unfortunately. And if you bring on board members who don't think like you, who have no loyalty or respect for the work that you do, they think it's so easy, or there's some people who literally, I had a situation where people were literally watching me work my tongue out, right? And waiting for me to leave. I didn't realize that until after I left. And it was painful. Those same people shut the door behind me. And so there's nothing you can do to prevent that. Okay. Again, that's a political situation. You need to make sure that the people that you bring on board, they share your values. They also have a certain loyalty to you, not that their loyalty to you should supersede their loyalty to the organization, but they understand what it is that you're trying to accomplish. They understand your values, they understand your value to the organization, and they would never do anything to cross you as long as you, the founder, are doing what you are supposed to be doing. Now, in those instances where there is a difference of opinion as to the direction, that is an indicator that the people that you have brought aboard probably didn't have the same core values as you. They probably didn't even have the same vision as you. That's what happened with me. That was part of what happened with me. And so like I said, the best way to handle that is politically keep your relationship strong and make sure that there are people who are loyal to the organization, people who are in your corner, and people who won't, undermine you. Maybe that's the best way to say it. All right. And I'm sorry I took so long to answer that, but I just felt compelled to say what I said. All right, so the vice president, we know, fills in when the president is absent. That means that they could run meetings. That means that they can sign checks in their absence. They, depending on your bylaws, and they can sign contracts in the absence of the president. And the treasurer, they keep track of the nonprofit's funds, they handle bank transactions, they sign checks, or they co-sign with the president. You should always have two signers And usually the signers are the president and the treasurer. Sometimes it's the executive director and the treasurer, but regardless of who the signers are, sometimes it's the secretary and the treasurer. They prepare financial reports and they manage the finance and budget committee. So again, Sai, this goes to your question, the number of directors, that is really determined by the type of work the organization does, its constituency, and the geographic focus. For your larger international and national organizations, it's not unusual to have a board of 100. I don't think anybody on this call has an international board. Smaller organizations tend to have a board membership of anywhere from 5 to 9. Larger organization, 17 to 25. Really, anything over 30 becomes unmanageable, right? But if you have a large international or a large national organization, you might not be able to get around that because you want to make sure that people from all over are represented. Now, there are terms and term limits, and terms are the number of years that you serve, right? So sometimes you want to limit the number of terms to 1 term, 2 terms, or 3 terms. And sometimes you want to just go on and not have term limits. And there are pros and cons for each. The advantage for term limits is the fact that you keep your leadership fresh, right? Sometimes boards get stale. They've been together for so many years that they start completing each other's sentences. The thinking becomes very closed-minded, and that's very, very difficult. Over time, it's difficult to move the organization forward. When you have term limits, you keep fresh blood in. However, even though you get a sense of urgency to complete stuff, that's always a good thing. You can disrupt the flow, the continuity of your leadership. So that would depend on your personal, your organization's circumstances. So the best practices for managing a board, you want to have written descriptions for each office. And again, if you're a member, I have some of those for you I can share. And these are generic descriptions that you can tailor for your individual board. You want to create work plans and carry out goals and objectives. And this is another way, Sai, to answering your question, how do you keep people on? When people know that there's something that they have to do, that they're working toward a goal, a good way to do that, create work plans and carry out the goals and objectives. That keeps people very interested and engaged. You want to develop performance expectations as well as removal policies. And those removal policies should be in your bylaws, and you should probably have a more detailed policy to establish what constitutes cause for removing people, and make sure you enforce those rules. Sometimes we create these rules in our bylaws and we don't have the political will on our board. Sometimes people be like, oh, this is my friend, I can't do this, can't do that. But you have to uphold the rules of the bylaws to keep things moving appropriately. And then you want to establish a board development committee for ongoing training, development, and management. To have effective board meetings, obviously you have to meet, and you really should meet regularly, and you should meet in the manner that's prescribed by your bylaws. You want to invite staff and outsiders where appropriate, and you want to give notice of meetings as outlined in your bylaws, and you want to draft an agenda and stick to the agenda. Our board life cycles tend to have 4 parts. First of all, you have the initial incorporators, you've got the organizing board, you've got the governing board, and you've got the institutional board. The initial board of directors, or your incorporators, this is a group of people whose names appears on the articles of incorporation and in your filing papers. And at this point, there are no officers, and for all intents and purposes, they're placeholders until your first meeting of the board of directors where you have an election. And I might add that when you start that first board, have in mind which ones of those people, which offices you want those people to serve. Then we have two major types of organizing boards. We have the organizing boards that follow the leader. So these are usually small organizations, small boards, and they're often homogeneous, meaning they have very similar backgrounds and they tend to be close friends and associates of the leader and the leader or the founder. And the members join to support the leader, and that's usually the founder. And the founder tends to be very, very passionate. And the board meetings tend to be informal, and they may or may not have minutes. But I suggest to you, I don't care how small your organization is or how informal your meetings are, always have minutes. Minutes are legally binding. And if there are any votes to be taken, they should be recorded properly. Organizing boards that tend to lead or control the organization. And these are usually a small group of willing workers. They're willing to work cooperatively for a cause. And again, they're often a homogeneous group. They think similarly, have similar attitudes, and they tend to be a close-knit group of people. And some people might even call them clannish. You know, if you're not one of that crew, people might perceive you as being clannish. And if you're part of that crew, you might perceive yourself as being cautious. And it's a delicate balance that you have to strike. So the members tend to have a strong sense of ownership, which is excellent. You really, really want that. And all members tend to participate in fundraising. You really, really want that. And the group typically grows faster than a group where you have a follow the leader mentality. And then we're going to talk about some of the common issues with follow the leader. With the follow the leader, we often have what we call founder syndrome. And that founding leader tends to be autocratic and not always open to others' opinions. And it's difficult to get work done effectively because the members tend to be very reliant upon that leader, so to speak. So the other members, Sai, I think you were talking about this, the other members are not likely to carry their weight or follow through on commitment because they're there really because of the leader. And they tend to rubber stamp the decision made by the leader because they don't really care one way or the other what happens, or they may trust the leader so much they don't feel like there's a need to question the leader's decisions. And the members usually don't participate in fundraising. So some of the common issues with boards that lead there's a blurring of the lines. Remember, we talked about how they have so much ownership, right? They do fundraising, they're doing the work of the board, and you never really have problems getting them to do work. But once you bring on staff, it becomes a nightmare, sometimes, because these people retain ownership and you can't really separate the lines between what they might do and what the staff does. Okay, and Sai says that is exactly what I want to avoid, hoping for fresh ideas and a leadership team. All right, so you're going to have to be more deliberate, and it will probably take you a little bit longer, right, to bring on your team. So again, when you have boards that lead and you bring on staff, they often don't want to relinquish their responsibilities. They might even delay hiring decisions because they might feel that if you hire somebody, that takes away from what they're doing. And in the ideal situation, you want to take away from the work that they're doing, right? Because they're there to govern. And members might also want the jobs themselves, but are reluctant to make a choice for fear of causing friction within the board. I think that's what happened with me, quite frankly. I think the people who didn't want me around actually enjoyed not being around. They were just laying in the cut, quite frankly. Members are reluctant to share their power with the staff. So that that's one of the growing pains that you might experience, and you're going to have to try to put some systems in place where you undergo some board development, where you clearly outline the roles and responsibilities, but at the same time, you don't want to alienate those people who've been working, right? You have to make sure that there's an evolution of their role. So as they're relinquishing tasks, they're not relinquishing value. So you need to develop a board to accommodate growth. So you want to bring on new board members with additional skill sets and resources, for example, fundraising, program development, legal and financial, and you want to have a more formalized structure. Again, you want to have committees, and you want to have a description of what these committees, you want to have clear responsibilities, and then you want to have more formalized systems such as strategic planning, budgeting, and program evaluation. And I was saying before, you need to clarify the roles of board and staff, and the members of a follow the leader board may have difficulty taking ownership of new tasks. So that is going to be something that you're going to have to work through in terms of board development. And it may come to a point where you may have those people who don't want to take ownership of new responsibilities, have them serve in an advisory role, so that the business of the board can continue uninterrupted. Another issue, members of the board that leads may have difficulty delegating. And again, as I said before, you want to create a situation where you're elevating their responsibility and value, but diminishing the actual work and the tasks that they do hands-on. And then you have staff from organizations for either type of the board, they resent the board members being hands-on. So the challenges of transitioning to a volunteer governing board from, one of those working board is the change management. You got to manage the cultural change brought about by bringing on new people and systems while remaining true to the mission. And I would caution you too that you don't want to do this too quickly. You want to, because if you do that, change is hard anyway. And as you make changes, there's going to be some dynamic tension. And if there's too much tension, things could either blow up or they could end up, you could lose a lot of people. There is also an entrenchment of old ideas versus fresh ideas. And you need to establish trusting relationships between the old guard and new members. So this is going to require some team building. And you want to make sure that all board members remain actively engaged and be sure that programs remain relevant to the community and potential funders. So in this case, you want to do strategic planning, board recruitment and orientation, and make sure that you have a package that people can refer to as they're being oriented. And also this package of information should be something that they can keep with them and bring to meetings. And then you want to have a board development committee that is constantly developing people and creating the environment where there's a team environment. And then you want to have those job descriptions and you want to evaluate people's performance. Now, an issue that comes about with communication is sometimes we have hidden agendas. People might say one thing, but they're really trying to accomplish something else. And there may be conflicts that arise because one member makes a controversial public statement while representing the organization, or while people presume or assume that this person represents the organization. So some of the tools you can use, have open and honest communication. Nobody is going to volunteer if they don't feel that they're getting something out of volunteering. That could be a sense of satisfaction that they're helping to change the world. It could be satisfaction of increasing skill sets. So people need to be very open and honest about what it is they expect to get out of this. And then you, who are already on board, need to be either accepting or not accepting, depending on what it is people want. You don't want to have a situation where what people want is in conflict with what you're trying to achieve. But another way you can mitigate conflicts is have disclosure statements, and then have policies around communication. How are you going to communicate to the media? How are you going to communicate with the public? And then another problem is board operations, getting stuck on old business. You might find an agenda item that just stays and stays and stays and never moves off the agenda. And then recruiting and retaining good board members. So some of the tools you can use are consent agendas. That way you can approve several items, at once, things that tend to be routine in nature. You can have board recruitment and orientation packages, have consistent onboarding, have a nominating or board development committee, and board evaluation forums. And ethics, we're always challenged with ethics. There's always a potential for conflict of interest. There's potential for engagement in partisan political activities, especially around election time. There's pressure to hire friends, relatives of board members, or associates of funders and others with influence. And quite frankly, that's a political dance that you're going to have to do. And some of the tools that you incorporate will be things like conflicts of interest policies, statement of ethics, bylaws, policies on political activities, personnel policies and procedures. And then fundraising. It's very common to have trouble getting board members to participate in fundraising. In many instances, many people think that they don't have the skill. People feel uncomfortable selling. So some of the tools that you can use are having a board orientation and packet that will outline the expectation for people, especially as it relates to fundraising. Have the job description for the board, articles in the bylaws, fundraising policies and procedures. And if people don't feel comfortable doing the ask, see how much they can give. If you might consider a give or get policy. In terms of financial management, one of the challenges could be lack of financial accountability. And another challenge is difficulty with regulatory compliance, that is filing the 990s. So in this case, you want to make sure that you have financial policies and procedures in place that follow what we call generally accepted accounting principles, that have significant financial controls. And you also want to create a budget and finance committee. And your policy governing board. And in this case, it's a more mature organization, and you have a board chairman and the executive director, they begin to be seen more as a joint leadership team. And actually, you should incorporate that practice from the start so that as you develop from phase to phase, you minimize the tension with this. The board members begin to become less involved in the day-to-day operations, and then they assume more responsibility for governance, which is the policy and the strategy work. So they set strategic direction. They are responsible for program evaluation and financial oversight, and they are legally responsible, regardless of what stage. The board is legally responsible for whatever happens, even more so than the executive director. And then your institutional board, the organization is very mature. They have all systems in place to run the organization in an efficient manner, and they're usually larger than the typical board and often include civic leaders who are very prominent. And the major focus is to raise money for the organization, and they delegate many of the governance functions to an executive committee or a management committee. But remember, even though they delegate to an executive committee or a management committee, the full board still needs to control any decision. So the last thing I'm going to ask you to do, and we're not going to do it here because we don't have time, and I wouldn't ask you to do it here anyway. In the comfort of your own environment, I want you to assess your board. There's a board assessment tool in the handout. So if you click onto that link, you will get a box folder, and it will also have this board assessment. It's a 2-page assessment. So you want to do the assessment, and you want to find out how strong your board is in terms of best practices. You will rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 5 on a number of different items, and then you will count the number of scores you get, count the number of 5s, number of 4s, and all that good stuff. But score the application and see where you land. If the closer your average is to 5, the higher your capacity. The closer your average is to 1, then the more work you need to do. So, and just because you find yourself hovering around 1 or 2 or even around 3, don't be discouraged, because the goal is for you to take stock of what it is you're doing and then look at ways that you can improve. So you want to take this assessment from time to time and see how much you grow over time. And then I want to also encourage you to participate in future board development crowdcasts. We're going to have more in-depth discussions about the different types of boards, the different types of advisory boards. And then we're going to also share even more tools that you can use so that you can run your board more effectively. And if you are a member of Nonprofit Utopia, feel free to post any questions or comments that you might have. And then, either I will respond, we'll have people from the community to respond. So you can just put a question out there and people from the community can share their insights. Alrighty, so at this time, if you have any questions, if you're on Facebook Live, post your questions on Facebook Live. If you're in YouTube Live, post your questions in YouTube. And if you are here with me in Crowdcast, you can feel free to post your questions in the chat room and I will respond. If you are a member of Nonprofit Utopia, if you want to hold your question and just post it in a forum and see what other people think, you can do that as well. All right, so if there are no other questions, I am going to sign off. But for future reference, if you have any questions regarding this webinar, you can email me at valeriefleonard@nonprofitutopia.com. And again, if you are a member of Nonprofit Utopia, feel free to post in the Nonprofit Utopia forum so other members and I can see. And again, if there's any particular problem you're having and if there's any specific tool that you need, if you're a member of Nonprofit Utopia, then feel free to post. All right, so you can join the community utopia.mn.co. You can follow us on Twitter and you can also find us on Facebook. All right, so thank you so much. I realized that this was a long video, but I really, really appreciate your taking the time to join us, and I hope that you can use the tools that I shared. I would be really interested in hearing about your progress. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to sign off. And again, I say thank you, and I will talk to you next week. Oh, thank you. Got a great feedback from Sai. Perfectly timed with great information. Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who's joined us. You made my day. Take care.